Good day, everyone. This is Hani Salim of Critical Faculty. Today is a very special day for me. This is someone who I've watched his ideas grow over a number of years from a very young man all the way to somebody who's contributing so much to the debate around God's existence, understanding what's true, uh, what is it what is it to be truthful when you make a truthful statement, all the way to dismantling illogical thinking. I'd like you please to welcome with me Stephen Watford of Rationality Rules. How are you, Stephen?
I'm very well, thanks. Thank you very much for making the time to have this discussion. I'm really looking forward to it.
Thanks very much. The very first thing that I wanted to ask you is the fantastic name for your channel, Rationality Rules, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the name of my channel is Critical Faculty, which is meant to be play on words. Is yours meant to be very similar?
Yes, yeah. I have a background as a graphic designer, and I used to do ideology and stuff. Ideation, sorry, would be a better way of expressing that, the correct way of expressing that. And so I used to think a lot about logos and a lot about messaging and iteration and stuff like this. And so, yeah, it's a deliberate iteration. It's a deliberate. When it first came to my mind, I was like, "That's it. It's done, sorted." Whereas that often doesn't happen with the creative mind. Often it's like, "Oh, got a couple of ideas. Let's select that one. Let's pursue that one. See what works." But with Rationality Rules, it was just as soon as it came up, I was like, "Yep, that's it. Done. That works."
I just love phrases like that because it plays on the words, and you can conceive it in different angles. Depends on the emphasis you're trying to put on things. So
Yeah.
fantastic. Now I'm going to share it with my audience as well, because I've got an audience from the Middle East as well as Australia and New Zealand, and they might not have come across you before. And I want to share your channel, which has a substantial number of subscribers. It's grown so much over the years, and over 300,000 subscribers so far and counting. So this is Rationality Rules. Can you tell us a little bit, Stephen, about when did it start and what are you trying to achieve using this channel or this forum?
Yeah, great question. I guess really it's correct to say that the channel started long before it was a channel, because where it's me and my personality, it's really going to have its backstory and my backstory, which is that I've been really deeply interested in existential questions from a very, very young age. I had a bit of a rough upbringing, and it got me thinking about, justice and theological issues in general. And so just from a very young age, I've been interested in these kinds of topics. And as I got to university, I was studying graphic design, advertising, but I was making it so that my dissertation, all of my work was related to philosophically imbued topics. And I realized basically that I have to move into that area. That's what gets my engine going. And Rationality Rules was and is my way of expressing what my thoughts are on apologetics, on religious arguments, sometimes on political arguments, though not so much lately. So yeah, it started off as just a way that I can express my thoughts, because I thought that these views that I had wasn't being aired and wasn't being defended very well. And it just grew from there. These days, I'm pretty much taking all of the theological difficult questions, giving them a bit more breadth and depth, and interacting with theists and apologists as they try to defend those claims and defend against those objections. So yeah, it's just built up over time. It's evolved as I've evolved. It's very much a channel that's a personification of, I guess, the better half of me. And well, I'm very fortunate. I'm very lucky. Life is half chance, right? So I find myself quite lucky on that end.
And one of the things that I like about this generation of new thinkers is the likes of you and Alex would have episodes about you changing positions over time on different subjects. So you have no problems at all going back and say, this is how I used to think, and actually start critiquing your old self, showing that there's a dynamism to the human life. You gotta keep thinking. You cannot stand still, and you're going to keep renewing the vows with either what you know to be true, because at any moment, anything, new information could come in and it will change your world.
Yeah, precisely. And I am a philosopher before I'm an atheist, and philosophers are very much aware of the fact that, your views can change on some pretty important things. And let's say that you find an argument or you come across an objection that has some kind of interaction with your epistemology. Anything that comes after that node in your worldview is going to be affected by it, and it can have profound effects. So yeah, I've always thought, look, if you're in pursuit of truth, then you really should not be worried about expressing, even publicly, hey, I thought this and my views were strong on this, and now I've changed my mind. In fact, that's personifying the very values that I think are really important for humans to flourish. And that's true, even if it's that you've switched views from something that you would prefer to have, but you no longer have, which has happened in my case. So at least on some areas. So yeah, I just think that if you're going to preach something, you better practice it.
True. I broadcast a lot to the Arabic world, and very much similar to the sort of the old-fashioned, old-school thinking, the very bad reputation that comes with the word atheist. I remember Richard Dawkins telling that funny story about a mother talking to her daughter and said, well, I don't mind you not believing in God, but an atheist. It's got a very, very horrible reputation. When somebody from the Middle East hear this word, they come to conclusion about so many different things. And some of them are actually not in the definition of what atheism means. They think it's a rejection of God. They know God exists, but they're too proud to. I want to know from you, what is the definition of being an atheist, and what does it entail? Well,
one thing that happens in this kind of dialectic is theists like to focus on definitions that you'll find in books. And and then they may be pursuing where the word comes from, the prefix a meaning not, and then theist meaning God. But actually, if you trace it back, Christians were called atheists by the Roman Republic. And that's just not how words work. Words are not authoritative, rather they have usages, and those usages change over time. So when it comes to what is an atheist, it's like asking, well, so many different ways to pursue this, but the two angles that come to mind is you can either have an atheist as someone who just simply doesn't believe in a god. They reject theism. They don't assert that theism is false. They just go, look, I'm not convinced by any of the arguments in favor of Allah. I'm not convinced by any of the arguments in the Quran or the Bible. I don't think that they're divinely inspired. I'm not convinced that there's an unembodied mind out there that's omnipotent, omnipresent, etc., that's looking over us. And it's as simple as that. It's just, if you was to say the average Muslim, look, you don't believe in reincarnation, so you're an reincarnationist, then that's a complete mapping of what the vast majority of self-described atheists are. They're just not convinced. That's it. Whereas in the philosophical literature, you can't really work with that proposition and actually make any points about it, because you're talking about the epistemic state of mind of an individual. It's not a very workable proposition. So in philosophy, there's various definitions, but it tends to be cashed out as the proposition that there are no gods. It's actually a positive claim that there are no gods. And both of those definitions are fine. It's a bit like the word theory. You and I might say, hey, I've got a theory that the models behind you are from a certain franchise or something like that. And that's obviously me using the word theory far differently to how I would use it in a scientific context. No one's crying and getting upset by the fact that we use theory in two different ways. Atheist is the same. It's used in a multiplicity of ways, particularly with lack theism, if you want to call it that route, and also as the positive proposition that there are no gods. So yeah, it's a funny one. When debates revolve around definitions, it can get very tedious, very boring, and it's normally, if someone's trying to pigeonhole you into a definition that they have, they're not really normally interested in a conversation. It's rather about point scoring.
I completely agree. It's going to end up being a semantics sort of game. But one of the things, because it will change your stance, and it's to do with the burden of proof. Because if you can adopt, hey, I'm naturally a disbeliever, this is how I was born, and I don't need to lift a finger, it will change your stance about the engagement. Because I'd rather attack the issue. I'd rather to make a claim and I'll start to prove it. So I think that situation about burden of proof and an atheist does not carry the burden of proof to prove anything, because I'm not trying to prove the existence of anything. I think it's a little bit of a intellectually lazy. You're leaving the other party to do all the work, and you're just saying, look, I don't believe in what you're saying, and case is closed. But I like to put a positive case, saying, well, I think the concept of God is, for example, he is the married bachelor that we're talking about. That's the breach of one of the logical laws, and therefore not just doesn't exist, cannot exist.
So with you rejecting reincarnation, do you think that you're obliged to give arguments for the opposite? Do you think you're obliged to say, here's some reasons to think that reincarnation is contradictory? Or do you think it's okay to just say, actually, no, I'm just not convinced by any of the arguments of reincarnation. I happen to additionally think that reincarnation is false, and here's my arguments for it. Because that's how I would see the atheism situation. I don't think the atheist has any burden whatsoever on the lacktheism definition. They're just not convinced by any of the propositions. Whereas if they're then going to say that there are no gods, such as like I would, then you do inherit a burden of proof, and you need to actually say, well, here's why. We have these contradictory propositions that are assumed of God. We have the problem of evil that seems to be a contradiction of God, and you can start running down, those routes. So do you apply that to reincarnation?
Yes, I will still have to reason why it's not reasonable to think reincarnation exists, or at least I would have to put it like a Russell teapot that is orbiting the Jupiter. It might exist, but if I cannot prove it or disprove it, what kind of life would I lead based on the belief or disbelief? So I can say, well, it might actually well exist, but I'm not going to build my life on the back of it. I might just park it for a while until there's such evidence that can be presented that will convince me, and that'll be about it.
Of course, and then of course, that their response is going to be, listen, if you're wrong about this, then we're talking about eternal consequences. So we can do this probabilistic Pascalian reasoning to show that you really should care about that, even though you have no ability to, meet that burden. It's a funny game.
Well, it poses even more problem on the proposed God, because if physics to the quantum mechanics and to the very difficult in the universe is intelligible, which means you can actually make an understanding of what happens behind you, and seemingly this God wants to have a relationship with you, is open, and that's going to lead us to the divine hiddenness argument at some point in this conversation. Why is he, or a lot of people can't find him easily and cannot be convinced, and so it will actually pose a problem on the intelligibility of God. It's going to make a problem.
Bringing up the problem of eternal torment and then squaring that with divine hiddenness. Good luck. Have fun with it. Because
our conversation is going to definitely progress to that point, because I think that, to me, it's one of the strongest arguments ever presented. So you are currently a positive atheist. Do you reject all kind of gods? There is no possibility of any. What about a creator, not a god, because he's not worship worthy, but some sort of a creator who's indifferent, not evil, not good, just indifferent?
So you're saying a creator which is conscious. So it's a deliberate act of creation, like it's an unembodied mind, let's say. No, I think we have enough positive reasons to think that unembodied minds can't exist. I think there's plenty of evidence to support that. What's a weird thing that happens in this kind of conversation is we're expected to prove things to such a degree that you can show that it's a contradiction to believe the opposite. And yet that's not how it works in every other domain of discourse. You just need sufficient proof for it. So you take like the Earth being a sphere. We've got so much evidence to show that the Earth is a sphere, but is it logically possible that the Earth is flat? Yes, it is, because you could cash this out as a lot of the proofs that we have being parasitic on things that are false. You could have it so that there's illusory elements that are playing in, but like for all intent and purposes, it's like, no, the Earth is a sphere. Would you defend that positively? Yes. likewise, it's like, can you prove that there is no Greek pantheon? No, I can't. So it's possible that the Greek pantheon exists. Yes, it is. But you're still positively asserting that it's not the case. Yes, I think there's enough evidence to suggest that that's absolutely not the case.
What about non-supernatural super entities? Let's say the universe that we live in is about 13.8 billion years old, but it will emerge from another collapsed universe. And we're talking about somebody, an entity, that is evolved for about 100 billion years and has sort of evolved over time. And they've got a body. They're probably evolved based on Darwinian evolution, so they've adapted, but they've lived for so long, and they passed on their genes, and it got refined over time, and they became a super entity, non-supernatural, natural, but way more advanced, almost like the idea of a simulation. And that we live in one right now, designed by that particular entity that doesn't care too much. It just creates for fun.
There's an interesting, I'm sure you're aware of this, but there's an interesting hypothesis that's expressed that says, look, if you take all of the simulations that we've created already, like in video games and whatnot, and the fact that we're getting more and more advanced with the kind of simulations that we make, and that there's really good reason to keep creating those simulations because they're very creative and they can give us information and yield facts and information that we may not have been able to figure out in our own time line, basically within like the space that we have. By running those experiments, by having those simulations, we actually have a motive to do that. Well, if you consider the fact that of all of these, say, realities, we think that ours is the real reality, but all of these other ones are simulations, you can extrapolate from that and reason from that to suggest that probably, in fact, very, very probably, ours is a simulation. And that seems to map on quite well with the proposition that you just mentioned. I mean, you could drop the idea that it's been around for 100 million years, but like you can see that it maps on like that. My thoughts to that is a rather interesting and compelling argument, and I would have more trouble being able to dismiss that than I would, say, Abrahamic theism by quite a long shot, because it's not pretzeled itself into logical contradictions, and it doesn't endorse slavery and misogyny and homophobia and all the rest of it, despite being all loving. It doesn't have any of those burdens and any of those issues that count towards evidence of it not being true. But I don't think that there's so many propositions that we can express that are unfalsifiable. But the fact that they're unfalsifiable isn't a feature. It's a bug. It's not a good thing. And the natural disposition isn't to say, I can't disprove it, therefore, I think it's true. Or because you can't disprove it, it's somehow disingenuous to say that you think that that's positively false. It's like, well, no. I mean, like, if you want to go for a completely logical sense, like if you was to put my feet to the fire in a deeply philosophical sense, then of course I have to be agnostic on things like that. And I am. But for all intent and purposes, no, I have no reason to think that that's true. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, completely. I mean, this is Nick Bostrom's, as you know, the Swedish philosopher's theory, and his expectation is 1 out of 3 chances, 33%, that we live in a simulation. But there were some cosmologists and people that worked with IT. They actually said, well, there are some issues with here, because to simulate the world we live in, we need exactly the same amount of energy encompassed in the whole universe to make.
You see, like, sorry to interrupt. That's a really interesting objection, but the objection itself seems to be almost begging the question, in the sense that it assumes the parameters of our universe, and it's like, but who's to say that it's programmed that way? Take video games. In a lot of video games, you can double jump. It would be like them reasoning, like, yeah, but every world's got to have double jump in it. No, it doesn't. Like, that's a presupposition that you're assuming of every possible state, and it's like that might not be the case. So conservation of energy might be might be a rule for our game, if our simulation. But I don't see how we can say 100% that that's true of other worlds. And what I'm kind of doing here is I'm flipping that burden element here, because now I'm saying that, can you 100% prove that there's not other states where the conservation laws are are false. Like, are you sure about that? And it's basically, it just flips the dialectic on its head, and all of a sudden they're not going to want to make that positive claim for the same reasons that they think it's unfair for me to make those positive claims.
Great. And obviously this simulated universe might end up being a very small fraction of the real universe, and therefore it's actually a small fraction of the energy used. There's also a concept called the JIT rendering. So like in a game, I'm a gamer too, I love gaming. You render the information as you actually get closer to the action. Before that, the information isn't available, and the grass or the lawn, or it only gets rendered as you get closer to the action. And therefore, some people, this is a funny bit, the cosmic speed limit of 300,000 kilometers per second, the speed of light, they're actually saying this is a cosmic loop input, so you don't find out who's at the end of the rendering. You're going to discover who's playing the game.
There's a physicist, I believe he's a physicist, called Leonard Susskind. Absolutely phenomenal. He gave, talking of changing my views, right? A while back, I started to think that the multiverse is probably true, at least the Everett kind of interpretation. I'm very agnostic on this, I should say, but like, I was I was leaning slightly towards maybe the multiverse really is the case, because it provides a really good solution to fine tuning. Since then, I've looked up all sorts of other rebuttals to fine tuning, and I've realized it's actually a really crap argument. But Leonard Susskind came up with, or expressed very well, that if the universe is just way, way bigger than you think, then all of a sudden it becomes really quite ludicrous to go, hey, right here we have very specific regulations. Let's assume that it's true for the rest of it. And it's like, nah, you can't do that. It reminds me again of something that I think Neil deGrasse Tyson said. It's like going down to, with these kind of statements that we make about the universe, it's the equivalent of going down the beach with a glass, putting a glass in the sea, looking at it and going, there's no sharks. And it's like, dude, you've got nothing that you can actually verify for the sea. You've got a tiny, tiny amount, and you experience the world in a tiny, tiny fraction. Like, we can't be making judgment calls like, yeah, these laws should be the correct all over the place, which for me, it's led me to, at least at the present, because again, I can change my mind, as a Humean when it comes to laws. I don't think
I completely agree. I think inductive reasoning, the way inductive reasoning helps science, because science is based on inductive reasoning, and it's helped us along the way. We sometimes abuse it a little bit, and we try to infer things that we understand to be intuitive to things like quantum mechanics or the universe itself. So, for example, the universe, the expansion of the universe is faster than the speed of light. Does it then reach the cosmic speed of light? Or you can't really use inductive reasoning to infer information on something that is a very small sample of the very large, and then the very large behaves in a completely different way. So I think you look
at composition fallacies.
Yeah, composition fallacies straight away. You got to stay agnostic, and you got to try to find out as you get there. But some impatient people will jump onto that and say, well, because you cannot explain this, therefore my version of a god.
The thing is the irony is, specifically with Christians, you get this, though I'm sure you get this with Muslims as well. Obviously, my experience is a little bit more with Christians. We have Muslims in the UK, of course, but like Christianity is the bigger one. And I've dealt with a lot of Americans as well, which, you've got Protestant Christianity very much in power there, is while they're dictating to us these frankly pathetic arguments that are devoid and bankrupt of philosophical, logical structure and evidence, while they're telling us exactly how the universe is, and they're making these broad assumptions about how the universe is, they always seem to lecture us on how important humility is. And I'm like, sorry, like, you're the one that's making these sweeping claims, and then you're mocking me almost for being agnostic on things that I can't possibly know. It's a funny one, but when a community spends a very long time and a lot of energy and effort and money pushing the idea that they're humble, you can bet that they're probably not.
Yeah, I mean, Christopher Hitchens is the one who used to crack me up by saying, "Excuse me, I'm on an errand for God." And this whole thing is made for me in sort of in minds, and I'm supposed to be the one who's arrogant, saying, "No, I'm actually the world and the universe is indifferent about my existence."
I've had it a couple of times. It's like people will talk about you know, you're leaning on your own understanding. It's arrogant and along those lines. And I have to remind them that by my model, we are a very insignificant species. As Carl Sagan said, there's no hint that anything out there is going to save us from ourselves. It's up to us to make the world a place that's worth living. And when we die, we're dead. Like, death actually means death. It doesn't mean, oh, you get to go to a new dimension. It's not death to now. No, you die. Okay, that's just the way it is. You're not important. Some people get a really raw deal. A lot of people get a raw deal, and then they die. Like, this is the way that I see the universe. And I think that our universe is almost certainly just one small segment in a vast sea of never ending. And it's just how humbling the experience of that model is just, it can crush people. It can cause existential dread. It can cause, you know, this nihilism beast that gets put across. And yet the religious person, especially if they're following, say, Islam or Christianity, they literally think that they're made in the image of God. And they're going to tell me about humility. They're going to warn me about being arrogant. It's like, oh, goodness me. Like, only religion could get you to think that's stupid. But yeah,
I agree. But faith is a belief without evidence, and it used to be enough. For in a world where the epistemic tools were quite scarce and rare. I can understand completely why people had to resort to this sort of mythical thinking, because they did not know any better, and they were sort of left to fend for themselves. They couldn't find out things for themselves, and therefore they had to believe in certain things. And that belief, believe it or not, I actually don't think religion was that harmful, at least in the very beginning, because it united people around an idea. That idea helped the group. You know, I think it had some healthy propositions to start with. It did not need to conform to reality, because that's not what we evolved for. We evolved to survive, and if it helps survival, it does not mean to. It doesn't need to be verified against reality. However, as theology advanced, people started to ask questions. And theologians, especially around the 7th to the 11th century, from Aquinas to Augustine, they started to come up with evidence for the existence of God, starting from the ontological one, Anselm, all the way to Aquinas and the Kalam cosmological arguments that William Lane Craig has sort of adjusted.
Al-Kindi, Al-Ghazali,
Yeah. So that ontological argument, I don't know if you read about it and you know much about it, but what is your critique? What do you think where that argument goes wrong?
Yeah, ontological argument. So are we talking about the Anselmian version?
Yes, Anselmian, yeah.
Yes, okay. So it's a really, well, Immanuel Kant said that the only real argument for God's existence is the ontological argument. And I think that that's true, because it's the only one that's going to get you to the Abrahamic God. All of the others don't. So take the watchmaker analogy. I think the watchmaker analogy is the most successful argument because it is so intuitively compelling. And it's still being argued against by certain Christian communities, and also, of course, in the Middle East with evolution denial. Although I have been impressed by how many Muslims are now accepting evolution. That has went up quite a deal. I know it's going to be a macro-micro distinction, but hey, progress is progress. The watchmaker analogy, really good argument. You look at like the complexity of yourself and you're like, this can't have been chance. And of course, assume we don't know about evolution by natural selection. You don't have an alternative model. You actually need to be a really smart person to figure out the fallacies that's going on there, I would argue. People did it. Percy Bysshe Shelley did it. Baron de Holbach made comments that did it as well. David Hume saw through it, because David Hume seems to have been an alien with just how incredibly impressive he was. So people could get through it, but until we had the alternative, the theory with Darwin and the progress that the shoulders that we stand on today, that was a very intuitive argument. However, it doesn't get you to God. Like, if you're going to make an analogy with watches, then actually polytheism is going to be a better definition. And it's going to be, you're definitely not going to be able to get the idea that God somehow has existed forever. Like, watchmakers don't exist forever. So if your analogy is going to draw from a watchmaker, you're not going to get that. You're not going to get omnipotence, because watchmakers are not omnipotent. You're not going to get, it's just, it does not get you to God. at least the Abrahamic God. And the same is true for pretty much every argument apart from the ontological argument, because the ontological argument is asking you to conceive of the maximally great being, a maximally great entity, and that's going to have omnipotence, it's going to have omniscience. So I think it's a good argument in the sense that it actually is an argument for the Abrahamic God. And I understand that with the other arguments, it could be said that they're stepping blocks to get you towards God, even though theists don't present them that way. So that's why I'm happy to bash them about like that. But yeah, in terms of the ontological argument, I actually think that Guanolo, when he replied to Anselm, did a perfectly sufficient job when he said, hey, I can conceive of the most perfect island. I think that objection on its own has done a really good job. There's one that we could extend it to. Another one is that you can think of a maximally great, this is actually an extension of that. You can say, I can think of a maximally evil being, and it would be, and a maximally evil being would have most people convinced that it's good. And this is like a build on from Guanolo's point. I think that does a really good job of making an expression, of rebutting the argument. Then what you've got is Hume's criticism of like, it doesn't actually make sense to say that if something exists, then it's somehow greater. It's like, no, we're not talking about things that it doesn't have to have existence to be the greatest of all possible things. And then, because there is quite a few, I realize I'm rambling now, but there's quite a few objections that come to mind that I like, but I would stick with Guanolo. Guanolo, I think, just did a good job from the beginning.
Yeah. My biggest problem with this argument, because it looks like eventually, like David Hume said, everything is a posteriori. Everything is a knowledge based on experience.
Yeah.
And even that, what we conceive to be a priori, it's reverse engineered. There's things that we sort of witness in our life, and we reverse engineer it and then abstract it, and then it sounds like it's coming from outside of us. It's actually,
yeah. So is that like saying that a priori is parasitic on a posteriori?
I think so. I really do think so.
Yeah, that's where my mind is at this point. So like some people say to me, like, can you actually have a priori knowledge? And I'm like, kind of no, because I actually think that the rules and the analytical framework that you've got is parasitic on your sense data. So for me, it's like I actually think that sense data is the bedrock. That's the thing that everything else is going to come from.
Well, that Anselm analogy is based on the human experience of comparative and superlative. We know this stone is this size. The other stone next to it is bigger. Oh, this one is the biggest of the three lots. So this is based on our experience about weak people, stronger people, and the strongest of all people. And then we go but if you end up with a small child who did not develop the prefrontal lobe cortex to understand these complex items, they are not readily available. The object permanence, which is a psychological thing about understanding that things are there even after you hide them, only develops in a human child about 8 to 9 months, in a chicken in 48 hours. So there are some cognitive ability that are not packaged already in the human brain, is based on that brain maturing plus some experiences for us to understand. So that ontological argument is based on human experience, where we go, well, there must be then, especially when you added the need for justice. So, that can go. This person must be judged for what they've done. There must be somebody who's stronger, who's going to put this horrible, horrible man into eternal torment as a result. And you put these two together, then you can conceive of something that does not necessarily need to be a reality, because not everything we think about in our brain, because it exists in our brain, therefore it must exist in the outside world.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. That got me thinking as well that another objection that can be raised on the ontological argument is the maximally great being for you isn't going to be the maximally great being for me, because we have different values and different perception of the world, and we accept different propositions. So, for example, a maximally good being for me is probably going to affirm veganism, whereas for lots of people, no, that's not the case. That's certainly not necessarily the case. And it's like, how are you going to square the fact that you'd have to say that I'm wrong in like my intuitions, in my arguments for moral views, or you'd have to say that someone else is wrong, and then you're just going to end up opening a can of worms and having to like follow the dialectic down quite a big stream. So that's another objection that came to mind from what you were saying there.
Yeah, so that's the ontological argument. Then St. Aquinas came, and science started to advance a little bit. People started to become interested in scientific evidence of things, and then came the cosmological argument. And then I think there were 4 cosmological arguments by St. Aquinas, plus he added the teleological argument that got popularized later on by William Paley, the watchmaker. Now, the cosmological argument that William Lane Craig is obviously parading, everything that begins to exist must have a cause. The universe began to exist. The universe has a cause. What have you got to say about this one?
There's a lot to be said about the Kalam cosmological argument. One of the questions that sometimes comes to mind is, why is so much attention brought to this? Because you can just accept the argument, at least on its face, and it just doesn't get you anywhere near God. Like, you can just accept that there's a necessary entity, even though it doesn't even get you to a necessary entity. It just gets you to, it doesn't even get you that far, but you could accept, say, the contingency rendition of it, or you could even accept the Kalam. It's just not going to get you to God at all. So why is there so much time and dedication put onto this argument? It's because, unlike, say, the watchmaker analogy, or say like the teleological argument, most of the arguments are basically the same argument with very slight alterations, and so the objections map on like one for one. So you could say, for example, a watch and how it's made, or you could like change that for, how complex a beach is, or you can mix it up, or DNA. But it's the same argument essentially. So the objections are going to map on. Whereas with the Kalam, there's like so many different arguments that are put across, say for that first premise, the causal principle of whatever begins to exist has a cause, and objections that are going to be sufficient for one type of argument to support that premise are not going to map onto other arguments that are used to support that premise. So the Kalam is a very interesting one, and it's quite hard to be able to make statements that are going to be sweeping for all of it, because there's just so many different ways that proponents defend that first and second premise. I will say that the stage 2, as it's come to be known, of tying that first cause, or that cause, with the universe, with God, is crap. It's just so awfully bad. And I say it, like, there's many different ways that it's done, but like they just seem to be so poor. Whereas the arguments and the metaphysics that's employed for the causal principle, some of them are really interesting. Some of them work very much against our intuitions. Hilbert's Hotel, for example, that's a really difficult thing for lay people to get their head around. Anyone that actually has a level of expertise in it, they'll just tell you that Craig is just wrong on what he's saying, and that absurdity, the word absurd, is doing all the work for him, and it doesn't mean contradiction. It can't mean contradiction unless he's talking to a lay audience, and then he'll make out that it is. But yeah, the Kalam is a bit of a mess. There's a lot of conversations happening around, especially that first premise.
I completely agree with you that every single argument for the existence of God is actually focusing on one point, whether it's the ontological, teleological, or contingency. They're all going back to the absurdity, or the human conception of that there's absurdity in going back all the way to infinity. There's got to be a beginning.
Yeah.
And that beginning, and this is where the leap of faith has to be. My version of God is that beginning.
Yeah, for one, when you look at the arguments or those statements, like Aquinas expressed, where they're basically saying, look, we can't go back, an infinite amount. It can't be turtles all the way down. And then they move on. And I'm like, why? Why can't it be in an infinite chain? Like, give me some good arguments for it without assuming that we can extrapolate outside of that infinite chain. And then, it's not clear to me that that's been
one of the arguments been said is because infinity has lots of paradoxes. Infinity is almost like the zero. It's an abstract concept. It's not a number. And there are a lot of paradoxes that sort of emerge from infinity, like the Hilbert Hotel thing, where you have a hotel with infinite number of rooms, that has infinite number of guests. If there's a new guest that wants to come to be accommodated, you can still accommodate them by moving guest number 1 to room number 2 all the way to infinity, and then he can squeeze. So with things like that, William Craig would argue infinity plus 1 equals infinity, infinity minus 1 equals infinity. Therefore, if there's infinite past, you cannot come to today.
There's a really good response from Alex Malpass, and Joe Schmid and others have really emphasized this. I think even Josh Rasmussen and Alex Proofs have signed off on this, if I'm not mistaken. They're both theists, of course, and they support the Kalam. They just do it through a different method. And what I'm saying here is that you're going to have to remind me of what you just said, because it maps onto what you just said. What was it? It was...
Well, the absurdity of infinity, that you cannot come to today.
Thank you. Yeah. That's it. It's that a potential infinite presupposes an actual infinite, because although like you're counting and you're never going to actually get to infinite, it's presupposing that there is the capacity to continue counting. For any number, you would be able to continue for infinite. So you're presupposing an actual infinite. And what Alex Malpass has done is he's flipped this to say that if you're going to deny an infinite past for these reasons, because of this absurdity, then you should actually also deny an infinite future, because it maps on 1 for 1. You could say that, hey, look, you've got the future that extends out forever, but for any day that you choose, any of them, there's always going to be a day afterwards. And the Christian and the Muslim are committed to this. They think that they're going to live forever. And yet the exact same kind of issues that they're raising maps onto the future. So they should, if they're being consistent, say that actually heaven isn't forever. They will eventually end. But they're not going to say that, because I really do like that response.
Where if the future is infinite, tomorrow should never come.
yeah, that's true. Define tomorrow.
Exactly. It gets very tricky. It becomes like a game of words, and defining words and defining them in a way that will suit you and will suit your narrative. And Jordan Peterson is, probably an opportunistic time to talk about him, because he is the master of that art. The art of even when he gets asked, God, what do you think of God? He said, well, it depends on what you mean by God.
See, he's masterful in the sense that he knows which things to answer and which things not to answer in a vague metaphorical kind of language. But I actually think that it's less to do with Peterson being brilliant and actually to do with a lot of disenfranchised Christians being pathetic. I think that rather than embracing the fact and, realizing, okay, theism's false, but there's some really interesting stories that are in the Bible, that's in the Quran or whatever it might be, and we shouldn't throw it away. We should utilize them for what they're worth. They're telling us something about us as a social species. We can make some progress and we can move forward. Rather, it's like, oh my goodness, I'm smart enough to realize that this is not literally true. It can't be literally true, but maybe it can be, true in some kind of more profound sense. And by speaking it in a metaphorical way, maybe like there's, I don't know, some metaphysical shift here that can make sense of it all. So my view, and maybe it's a little bit harsh, but I've really spent some time like listening to these people and interacting with these types of Jordan Peterson-esque individuals. I think it's less that Jordan Peterson is brilliant and more that his audience are pathetic.
Yeah, because you can do it in two different ways. I mean, Nietzsche said in his book, and God is dead. He actually wasn't celebrating. Zarathustra wasn't celebrating. He was actually saying, I'm actually worried because maybe the world is not ready. Like the God of Spinoza, I have a very strong intuition that Spinoza was trying to prepare the world to abandon God, but couldn't do it straight away. Karl Marx, when he talked about religion being the opiate of the people, if you finish the sentence, you'd actually say it's actually consoling. But you can still do all of that, saying religion isn't true, there wasn't a God, but I can completely understand why we had to use faith, why faith was quite useful at a certain point where epistemology and the tools of knowledge weren't there, and you had to gather around a certain emotion or passion to unite the group. But as the tools of knowledge evolve, we can abandon all of that, because one of the things that they actually thought about this new era of rationality is a world like Equilibrium by Christian Bale. That movie, it's a brilliant movie. A world deprived from emotions. We are just robots. We're thinking about everything. We can't cry at operas. We can't listen to music. We can't sit in Anfield and sing "You Never Walk Alone" and feel something.
That's true. That is how they see us. That's quite funny. Yeah. yeah. No, I just agree on that point. Yeah.
But what do you think? I mean, do you think then can we do what Jordan Peterson is doing, putting religion in context and respecting it for what it did, and reflecting on the human condition, but still at the same time saying, well, it is not true?
Yes, I think you can do that. So let's take Ramadan, for instance. So you got Muhammad conquering the Iranian peninsula, right? Absolutely conquering. And you've got all of these tribes that are now uniting slowly but surely under one banner. How the hell are you going to get cohesion here? Social cohesion. I think religion is an adaptation that really helps towards having a cohesive community, right? Making it so that we can work together. You share the same views, the same values, the same ideals, the same holidays. And what it does is it builds that community. That is, in my opinion, the primary role of religion. The secondary role is that it does possess truths in the sense that it relates to our, say, evolutionary psychology. So snakes coming up in all of these religions, it's got something to do with the fact that snakes have been one of our enemies for a very long time. Like, it's imbued in us. It's for the same reason you can throw like a cucumber at a cat and it will crap itself. It's like, why is it doing that? Like, what's going on? It's because its social software has evolved to have that reaction. And I think that that's also true of humans. It's not a mistake that humans don't like spiders, or a lot of them don't, because they are actually relatively deadly, or some of them are in Africa and some other places as well. Of course, I mean, Australia, you've got some nice ones there as well. When it comes to small children, it is genuinely a problem. Now, adults, it's just going to be a pain in the butt for most of them unless they're allergic. Anyway, slightly getting off, but bringing that back, I've lost myself again. Can you repeat where we was? I do apologize.
No, so we're talking about the intuition.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry to the audience as well. I didn't sleep very well last night. So if you take the conquering of the Arabian Peninsula and you need social cohesion, take Ramadan. Ramadan is a perfect social construct. What do? You get everybody, all of the people, or at least everyone that's eligible, which is to say that they can do it without having like very serious problems. They all share in a suffering experience, in a difficult experience, in something that really you can feel it. And that is that you don't eat. You don't eat for the day. You share this together. And then when you break it, when you say, right, now we should eat, you do it together in halls and in communities, smiling, sharing food. Like, you couldn't have a more obvious contrived situation, which is trying to develop social cohesion. And so I think that religion, you shouldn't just go, oh, that was false, let's get rid of it. No, that it's got elements that are important that we are going to have to replace, because they relate to the fact that we're a social species. So in England, and I assume that this is happening in Europe and in many places, probably even in the US, certainly in places where atheism is massively on the rise, it's like, sure, we don't go to church anymore. We don't have those communities, those aspects like that. But we do have sports. We do actually meet up for concerts. We do meet up for all sorts of events. And they are the element that's going to have to replace that component of religion. And it's really important to replace that part, because belonging is extremely important to religion. And you do really need to be offering and dealing with that node just as much, if not more, than the arguments and whatnot. So for me, it's like, you can see religion and go, look, it's not true, but that doesn't mean throw it away. But it also means don't talk about it as if it is true, because your audience, in Jordan Peterson's case, is too pathetic to recognize that it is crap in that sense and move forward. But yeah, I don't know. I've kind of had enough of Jordan Peterson. I think just it is pathetic. It's just pathetic the way that he talks about religion. It's pathetic the way that his Christian base sucks it up. It's cringe, proper cringy to watch.
He started to tickle as well the Muslim sentiment. He's had on his show a few Muslims
Yes.
of late, and they love it now.
Hmm.
uh, Another celebrity that I've been influenced by, and I love his work, even the not very religious stuff, Rick Gervais. Um,
Mm.
Rick Gervais always puts in any whatever show he's doing. I think Afterlife, he always add bits and pieces of banter, but a little bit of human experience. I think it was in extras as well, whereby if somebody's convinced about something logically, and you are confronted by somebody who's about to die, or somebody with a disability, and they believe in God, and this is something we have to develop as a secular community. If you go to funeral, you and I, you probably will struggle of what to actually appropriate to say.
Hmm.
Might come up with a couple of stuttering sentences, but there is nothing like, oh, your 2 years old little girl, I'm sure she's fine, she's playing now in heaven, and you're gonna get to see
Mm.
her again. How do you replace that power of consolation?
The problem is that religion tells you that you've won the lottery, and there's no nice way to tell someone that they haven't. And to expect that an alternative story is going to somehow compete with the fact that you've won the divine lottery, it's not. I mean, the most that we can really say of like a 2-year-old that's passed away is, we can get up there and talk about the fact that every atom that comprised that individual, all of it, still exists. It's still in the universe, and although she's gone, or he's gone, or they're gone, you've got this situation where, in a very real sense, they're still here. Like, we are, if the conservation law is true, we are really existing forever. It's just not as a conscious entity. So I guess you could argue we don't exist, and that's probably the correct thing to say, at least if we're calling us the conscious entity. But when someone dies, even when they're young, every relationship they've had, all of the experiences that everyone's had of that individual, that doesn't die. That's not dead then and there either. That lives in you, with you. It will motivate you, and in your actions, in the subconscious and sometimes in the conscious, like, they're very much a part of whatever you do. So let's say that parent is motivated then to like try and promote welfare and education to the disease that caused the child to die. Like, in a real sense, the child is a part of that. Like, if the child hadn't lived and hadn't had those experiences, then that wouldn't be moving forward. So there are more abstract and very real things that can be said that for me have profound value. But yes, it's very hard to compete against the idea of, they're alive in heaven and like they're all happy now and one of God's angels and whatever comes across like that. It's very hard to compete against.
Yeah, the divine lottery concept, I like the concept you propose here. In our life, practical intuition, buying a used car, winning the lottery, people are very, very skeptic then. They apply rigid rules of logic. They will ask for, okay, thank you, I won the lottery. When can I receive my money? Only religion will tell you you won the lottery, but you will only get paid once you're dead.
I know, and people, I know. One question that's come to my mind as of late is, if I had lived in certain different times, would I have been an atheist? Because obviously I'd be a fundamentally different person, but I'm assuming like the core of my personality, would I have been an atheist? And I've come to the conclusion that I probably would, but I would have had to have hit it. Because I just, you would have to change me so much in order to get me to not look at stories like that and smell bullshit, because it's just the way that I'm inclined. You'd have to change me to such a degree that I'm no longer me. But yeah, it's an interesting question to ask. Whether or
But
not
remember, us as well is part genetic and part epigenetic, which is the experiences you gain. And the current experiences we gain throughout our life is going to be kind of a 12th century. So I thought about the same thing, and I came to the conclusion I actually might ended up being some sort of religious, but I will not be orthodox. I will have my own twist on things at least, but because of the complete lack. Imagine this is a world they don't understand the basics of what we know now. I mean, we're so lucky to have lived in this kind of era. So lucky to know how much we've done. That's why I'm not very harsh on people who believed, and there's nothing else they could have done some 10 centuries ago.
Yeah, no, agreed. I think intuition plays a massive role. And also, if you consider, it's very hard to get your mind into what they saw and what they experienced, but I really can appreciate why a lot of people at least got to like theism, or at least to these religious dispositions. I think a good analogy is the flat earth. I think I've got no interest in mocking people that lived, say, 10,000 years ago for believing that the earth is flat. None at all. I think your intuition screams it. I think that your experience screams it. I can totally see why you would believe that. Hell, my intuition still tells me that the earth is flat. It's just I have enough and sufficient evidence to rebut that intuition, so I can realize my intuition is not very good there. Likewise, when it comes to surviving death, I mean, just consider the fact of what happens when we dream. If we didn't know anything about the brain and we didn't know anything about the way that the body works, it's almost like astroplaning when you sleep. It's like, what's going on? I'm like in a different dimension. Like, I haven't figured it all out, but it's very real. It's about as real as what I experience when I'm alive in some sense. Like, something's going on there. That's enough to affirm that there's some other realm kind of thing. And then what happens is what you see someone die. Well, you know that they can sleep, but this time they're gone. And you're thinking, okay, maybe they just were in that sleep state and they left. Maybe they've went somewhere, because we know that they can be somewhere without consciously being awake. So I can totally get it. I really do get where these intuitions come from. And then you take the watchmaker analogy. Like, if you knew nothing about evolution and you looked at the complexity of just like the nails on your hand, like the way that the hair grows, the way that, like, say, armpit hair only grows so long. Like, what is going on? Why is this so precise? Yeah, I've got nothing but sympathy for people that lived in the past, and I entirely understand why they fell towards theism. As you said, we are incredibly lucky to live in a day and age where we can recognize that, a lot of these thoughts and these intuitions are false. But it might also be said that we live in an incredibly unlucky time, because we're like some of the first, say, massive amounts of generations that have realized, wow, we are nothing in this universe. And that's quite a thing to chew for a lot of people.
Agreed. The truth and reality can be quite discomforting. So, yeah, you could argue that this might be unsettling for a lot of people. But if you're motivated by reality and you want to believe as another common friend, Matt Dillahunty, would say, you want to believe as many true things as much as you can, and that's what motivates you, then you will find actually joy in finding out the truth about things, even about you. We're discovering more about our psychology and about the cosmos we live in, and can be a bit unsettling to start with, but then there's something liberating about understanding the truth.
Well, it's also like the programming as well. So, like, if you take, say, Alex O'Connor, or you take Genetically Modified Skeptic, or basically a lot of the activists in the YouTube niche, they were Christian or they were religious. And so for them, there was a bit of deprogramming and like a realization of, wow, I thought things were that way, and now I have to come to terms with them being this way. I've never really believed in heaven. I've never really believed in the Abrahamic God. So for me, there wasn't this loss. For me, it's just been a progress of like, even from the age of 8, to me, I was like, religion's nonsense. It's just so obviously crap. They can't answer the most simplest of questions, and it's just there's so many signs to me that was like, no, this is nonsense. So I didn't have to give up like a belief in heaven. I didn't have to give up the idea of seeing my loved ones again. I didn't have to give up thinking that I'm really special in the universe. And I think that deprogramming for a lot of people must be much harder than the path that I've taken, where it's just like, oh, evolution makes a lot of sense of that. That's interesting. And then moving forward on that front. But it does take work to have enough humility to accept that you're not important in the grand scheme of things, but you are important to your species. You are important to those around you. And it takes a lot of work for a lot of people, it seems, to recognize that is enough. But I've been there for a while.
This is great. We're on top of the hour, guys. We've Stephen and I agreed about 90 minutes today. So this is the last half an hour. We will continue the conversation, but feel free to start asking questions about the areas we talked about today. So we talked about the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, the teleological, the one that is very intuitive, and it developed a couple of tendencies. One is biological, in the realm of biology, and another one in cosmology. One is namely ID, intelligent design, your Michael Behe and C. Meyer and the Discovery Institute folks,
Yep.
and the fine tuning, which is, according to Sean Carroll, is the only, even Christopher Hitchens, few people have said, if there is one argument that really stands out because it plays by the rules, it doesn't appeal to emotion, it actually says there are 26 cosmological physical constants. If they change by hair, life wouldn't exist. But even then, Sean Carroll said, it's a horrible argument for the existence of God. So let's maybe talk about the let's talk about because the fine tuning would have to be prior to biology. So we'll do biology last.
Sure.
What do you think of the fine tuning?
Yeah, I think that Sean Carroll's correct in his assessment there. It is a bad argument. One point that Sean Carroll expressed is so the theist is going to look around at the universe and go, look at these specific parameters. Oh my goodness. Then they're going to say, let me pull my Bayesian probabilities out of my arsehole, because that's what they've got to do in order to get, for some reason, their probabilities. Well, say for some reason, I don't know how the way that they often cash this out is it's just stupid. But then they're going to pull out their probabilities, they're going to do their assessment, and then they're going to make all sorts of assumptions about how the universe is and how it could have been and how it could not have been. And then they're going to say, look at these precise parameters coming up. I want to slap them then with Douglas Adams' sentient puddle. But Sean Carroll raised a really, really good point. I don't know if it originated with him, but I think that this objection on its own just ends it for me. We already know that there's other ways that life can exist. So it depends on how we define life, I guess. But conscious beings can exist because theists think they're going to survive their death, they're going to exist in heaven. So assuming they're subtly assuming that God only had one way to create life, and that is with the parameters that we see. But if God is all powerful and all loving, unless we have a reason to think otherwise, it seems intuitively obvious, which intuition is something that they like, or you could use other variations to make this case or make this point. It seems that God could have created life under all sorts of circumstances. Who's to say that life couldn't have been the size of planets? You really think an omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent being couldn't have achieved that? Who's to say that the parameters should have been the way that they are? Really? You're going to assume those kind of... you're going to put those kind of shackles on an omnipotent being? I don't think so. So Sean Carroll's point there, where it just destroys the argument from the get-go, because it makes the very observation of look how unlikely these circumstances are mute. It just takes them off the table. It doesn't matter, because God could have done it in any other kind of way. We have no reason to think otherwise. There's no contradiction in thinking that conscious entities could have existed in another form, especially given that theists think that they can in some kind of intangible sense. So I think that objection alone, just from the get-go, is brutal.
Well, actually, when you think about it, it will make actually these 26 constants more transcendent than God himself, because if there is a recipe to make a cake, and only through that recipe the cake will exist, the recipe to make the cake will be more superior than the maker of the cake, because if you choose some other way to make the recipe, the cake wouldn't emerge. Yeah. But if the maker is omnipotent, then he can make cake without having to resort to these 26 constants. So
I like the it's a good analogy. You could also say as well, it's like assuming that if the sugar wasn't exactly what it is here, and if the eggs wasn't exactly what it is here, then we wouldn't have cake. And it's no, we wouldn't have this cake. No, we wouldn't have cake at all. How do you know that? There's got to be how many different ways that God can make cake? There's got to be potentially infinite ways for God to make cake, because he could have made the same cake just with one less grain of sugar and one more atom of egg. and he could have made a different cake over here, and he could have done this. And it seems that the process of looking at the specific cake that we're in, if we're going to use that for the universe, and then trying to draw, like, look how improbable it is. It's like, this is ridiculous. You can't be doing this, especially not when you're making statements implicitly about an a omnipotent being. Like, it's just ludicrous. So I like that analogy. I think that's good.
It should be a situation where you go, this is a world that doesn't permit life. Why the hell are we here? That's a miracle.
Yeah.
But we are only exactly in the world that permits our existence. So there's nothing here to talk about.
The other objection that I find quite compelling, it doesn't seem to have so much impact on the believers, but for me, I think it's really good. It pertains to the problem of evil, of course, is that you can go, look, let's look at the universe. All of these precise parameters that have created the world that we live in, we have to assume that this is the maximally greatest, like the best of all possible worlds, because an omnipotent being can create the best of all possible worlds, and an omnibenevolent being would. So it's the best of all possible worlds, the Leibnizian situation. And are we really to believe that that means that a lot of people die of starvation, that children have cancer, that like the primary function, the primary way for us to get, say I've got white skin, the way that happened is that my ancestors were very fortunate in the sense that they could actually pass on the nutrients because their skin was getting whiter. Like, really, an all-powerful, all-loving God is going to construct such a ghastly situation where rather than just going, I'm going to create you like I created Adam, he's going to go, no, I really want, to be able to populate that part of the planet. So the best way to do that, the most loving way to do that, is to construct a situation where innocent people get annihilated for no reason that's inherent to themselves, but just because that's the way that evolution by natural selection works, which, by the way, I created. It's like, no, just no. Like, the universe that we see and the problem of evil being expressed in that way can be mapped onto the fine-tuning to say that, no, I really think that it basically serves as a defeater itself for it.
Okay, I'm going to start entertaining some questions. I would rather please answer questions that are very close to what we're talking about. This is going to be a sort of Islamic area. I'll answer it very quickly. Almost every timeline I've seen regarding Muhammad's timeline excluded Muhammad's career as a trader. I think I know why, but can you discuss this, please? Well, when he married Khadija at the age of 25, that's before the revelation of Islam, between 25 and 40, he was married to Khadija. And he was a trader. He helped her with her trade. Went to Syria, allegedly went to neighboring countries, and people would actually say this is where he learned the trade of the prophecy, of how to construct a prophecy, and learning the books like the Torah and the Bible. It's not talked about because it's pre the era of revelation, and therefore it's sort of brushed upon, but it's not really, they don't go in depth because that's before the revelation of Quran.
So a comment I have on that is, suppose that we were talking about Hitler, right? Yeah, I'm going there. Screw it. We're talking about Hitler, and we're talking about what happened with what he did in Poland and what he did in Europe in general. And the reason being is that it's in relevance to pointing out something to do with the war. So, by example, when we were mentioning Muhammad, we were talking about Ramadan. We were talking about the fact that he conquered these tribes and then needed a way to unite them. If someone was to respond by going, why is it that no one ever brings up the fact that before that, Hitler was a really good painter? It's because rather than dealing with the criticism that's being expressed, it's made them uncomfortable by the way that I've been mentioning the topic. It seems to me, maybe I'm wrong. And so rather than dealing with that, they're like, but no one ever mentions the nice things about Muhammad. And it's like, look, I'm sure Muhammad was a nice guy in lots of ways. He also killed a lot of people. He also conquered a lot of people. And when someone points that out, it's just ludicrous to just go, oh, I know you wasn't talking about pain, talking about the fact that he was a trader, but why don't you mention it anyway? It paints him in a nicer place. No, don't. I'm wasting my time.
Agreed. I think the human brain still thinks in pure evil and pure goodness.
Yeah.
And as I'm getting older now, I can see. I mean, I think we are gone beyond that. Even in the modern cinema, I've always said that before. Villains backstory, like the Joker and stuff like that. And they're showing that nothing is pure evil and nothing is pure goodness. There is that sort of different areas in your life where you can trade places for it briefly.
That's good. You can actually do that in the reverse. You're right. You can do it with the good as well, because you can say, let's talk about Thomas Jefferson. Let's talk about the founding fathers of the USA and the values that they had. And then someone can respond going, yeah, but why don't you mention the fact that they had slaves? And it's like, oh, for goodness sake, like, I mention them in a good light. It doesn't mean I think that they're the best ever. Likewise, I don't think Muhammad was just an evil individual. He wasn't. It's just, it's
in the new Netflix adaptation of Karate Kids, Russo, who's supposed to be the Karate Kid, the boy that the butter would not melt in his mouth. He's always good. He's actually shown to be an asshole in Karate Kid. And the bad guy, the villain, they start showing you that he wasn't actually. He might have been just a victim of his circumstances, but given a chance, he's actually showed himself to be a better person. And Russo, who was supposed to be pure goodness, ended up doing some stupid things.
I think this is why series such as The Boys and Game of Thrones have done pretty damn well. Yeah, like you've got, like in The Boys, they show you the Deep. He basically rapes one of the protagonists. And yet, like the rest of the series so far, I haven't finished series 3, but like what they're doing is they're showing that he's a very broken individual that's been incredibly mistreated his life. It could be argued that they're humanizing him. And it's like, well, yeah, like you can humanize people that do bad things because they are humans at the end of the day. It doesn't make what they did right, doesn't justify it in any way. But human nature is grey. Human actions and human history is grey. And I think a lot of people are just getting tired of the binary stories that you often see in the Bible, to be frank. Like, and you see it in the Quran, like these binary black and white stories, these black and white understandings of things. It's like it's not like that in the real world. It's not. It's very mixed. It's very grey. Everyone's got sins, if you want to put it in that language.
Completely agree. This is a question for you, Stephen, about the nature of time.
Okay. Yes. So let me read it then. So Stephen thinks the role emergent time. Do you want to give that question a bit more legs, if you wouldn't mind?
Yeah, I think it needs a bit of elaboration, but I think he's in it. If we only conceived of time as an emergent property, so time is not fundamental,
right?
And we were only thinking of time as a concept. What if time maybe wasn't fundamental? What if time is an illusion? The word beginning doesn't even mean a thing.
So it seems that you can have time be an emergent property without it being an illusion, right? So like time could be a very real thing. It's just it is contingent on something. A bit like say the liquid state of water. It's contingent on H2O, and if you don't have H2O, then the water doesn't exist. There's a way that could be said that the water is like an emergent property of the collection of H2O atoms. Maybe time is an emergent property of, say, gravity. We already know that there's a relation there thanks to Einstein and whatnot. My ultimate answer to this really is I don't know. I'm very agnostic on things like this. I don't know. If you held my feet to the fire, I think that time probably is an emergent property of gravity. I think that time isn't probably an essential, but it's only like by a tiny fraction. Like if it turns out that it is, okay. Like I really don't know on that question. It's a very difficult one.
Yeah, because there are two different theories anyway, the A and B theories of time, and it depends what time you're talking about. If you're talking about the time that is intertwined with space, it's a part of the canvas of that fourth dimension, then it's slightly different than the arrow of time. And I think the arrow of time is more of a human concept that doesn't exist.
Yeah, I think B theory is probably more likely to be true as well. So. And people with expertise to say that as well. So there's numerous reasons for it, but beyond my pay grade.
Well, people are preparing more questions. The two arguments, so we talked about arguments for the existence of God. Now we're going to talk about arguments against the existence of God. And there are two, there's more than two, but the two strongest is the problem of evil or suffering. I like to call it suffering. I think the word evil and goodness are not really words that I would want to use. Got religious connotations, so I'll call it suffering. People like Bart Ehrman left their faith because of that. And there's the Schellenberg argument, which is the divine hiddenness. Which of the two? And I know Matt Dillahunty is very, very attracted to the divine hiddenness as the stronger of the two. Which one you lean towards to choose as the strongest possible argument?
I think the divine hiddenness is very, very strong if you assume eternal torment, if you assume anything other than universalism, to be frank. Even annihilationism, I think divine hiddenness is an extremely potent and powerful argument. However, if you think that everyone's going to end up in heaven, I actually think that argument is not as compelling. So I would be more leaning towards the evil one out of those two. I think that, or the suffering. I think that the tremendous, insatiable amount of suffering that exists in the world, in the universe, in just what was necessary for us to develop, the facial structures that we have, or our form of locomotion. I think that's the better one to lean on. And I don't think that there's doctrines that can be taken other than giving up one of the triomni attributes of God, at least one of them, that's going to ever be able to deal with the problem of evil, not sufficiently. So I would go more on the problem of evil angle.
Yeah, the proposition of everybody's going to end up in heaven always struck me as there's something absurd about it. I'm trying to imagine a situation where I've got a puppy, and I love that puppy. The puppy has to go through a long hall of other big dogs that want to bite him and want to probably kill him. And that puppy has to mature very, very quickly, draw wisdom, and try to escape that tunnel or that hole to the very end. And there are two possibilities. That puppy is going to end up learning very fast, evading every single attack, and make it all the way to the end intact. Or the puppy is going to be eaten alive by the other dogs. But it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, at the end of that hole, I've prepared a beautiful bowl of milk and a nice warm meal for that puppy to enjoy, and it's going to be happy ever after. As the person who created that situation in the first place, am I justified to get that puppy to go through that experiment because of the very end result?
So my intuition would be very much no, but then when it comes to morality in general, I'm not really someone that leans very much on the objective side anymore. So there's that to be said. I think that the theists could defend this by appealing to Molinism, so that they could say that God knew that puppy A only needed to get past the second dog and then get chewed by the third dog. He knew that was sufficient development to get them to the state to be in heaven. Whereas he also knew that puppy B needs to get all the way across the dogs and not get eaten or not get killed. So he knew exactly what kind of conditions they needed to develop to a sufficient degree, and he made it so that they do get that far. So although for us, we look around and we go, oh my goodness, that child died at 2 years old, and that person smoked his entire life and was an arsehole his entire life, and yet he got to 90. Although to us, it's I can't make much sense of it. If you adopt the right, I say the right, they're controversial, and some of them are not very scripturally sound at all. I don't think universalism, for example, is very well attested. I think William Lane Craig is right to point out that it's born out of basically people wanting it to be true, to be able to deal with some of the more potent criticisms that's expressed, at least in terms of Christianity. But I do think that if you buy the right doctrines, you can probably tell a consistent story for why it is that dog A only gets two dogs in, and dog B gets all the way. So I think that they can do that. With the problem of evil becomes so much more difficult to do it, and when people do it, they sound as in tell a consistent story, and when they do, they sound insane with some of the things they say. So they could appeal to the greater good theodicy, and they're going to want to do it in such a way that humans aren't treated as a means to an end, rather they're treated as an end in themselves. And they'll tell you contorted stories about dentist analogies and stuff like that. They just sound nuts. Completely insane. They don't like consequentialism, but as James Fodor has expressed, they sound like Giga Chad consequentialists when they're talking about this stuff. It's like, no, all of this is justified because of heaven. And it's like,
God is the biggest
me.
consequentialist in the whole, I mean, in the narrative of God. He is
Yep.
doing it himself.
Yep, exactly. It's justified. It's for the greater good. Okay, if you say so. Why in Numbers 31, 17 through 18, does God command, through Moses, that they go in and they kill everyone, and they kill all of the little boys? You're a little boy, you're dead. And they kill the women, but all of the women that haven't slept with men, so the virgins, the little girls, I'll keep them alive for yourself. And then per Leviticus and per all of the other quotes, that even meek and mild Jesus didn't come down and rectify, you know that slavery is okay. And it's like, what is going on? That's monstrous. What's going on? That's it's egregious. Even to your intuitions today, what's going on? There must be a reason for it, will be the answer you'll be given. It's for the greater good. It's like, I can't help you, and neither can Jesus. Like, you're just hopeless.
Considering the same God was very upset about slavery when his favorite people were enslaved in Egypt, to which no archaeological evidence whatsoever exists. I'm Egyptian, and I can tell you, when Israel occupied Egypt in 1967, the University of Israel, different universities went to Sinai area, because this is where they got lost for 40 years. You think, well, they reckon up to 1.2, 1.3 million people were lost for 40 years. We're talking about, average life expectancy was about 25 to 30 years. And therefore, you might have a couple of generations emerging, or a few more generations within that 40 years. They looked at everything to find just a needle or any proof of existence. They did not exist in that area.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult. Now, Otangelo is a very interesting Christian. You probably have come across him.
Yeah, I know.
He's talking about the Shroud of Turin as evidence for Jesus.
So let's look at you saying Jesus become man, no hiddenness, no justification, and we have the Shroud of Turin, the first selfie made 2,000 years ago. Great argument. Like, I don't know what to do with that. Like, you could do this in any context. If this, it's just.
I love that, the first selfie.
Do you want to know what's amazing though? Because I'm pretty sure that he affirms eternal torment. It's like, if you're not convinced of what he's just put on screen and some further points that he might express, then you're deserving of eternal anguish, of eternal suffering. Or even if he did go for say annihilationism, you're deserving of not being in the presence of your Father. It's like, you couldn't make this stuff up. It's such nonsense. It's an insult to anything that could be remotely considered good.
Yeah, I think eternal torment, that sort of concept, it doesn't matter if it's divine hiddenness or problem of evil. I think it finishes the conversation, because an omnibenevolent God cannot coexist with that particular idea. Because considering that we have been created out of nothingness, we have not asked to be here. We're thrown into this experiment, just like that puppy that I was saying. Well, if the final result was that heaven, why not create heaven and throw everybody in it to start with?
Yeah,
and skip the whole scenario.
Yeah, it's a great question.
We've got another 7 minutes, so if you have any interesting questions, please put them forward. Last thing that I want to finish with, I've turned vegetarian myself about 4 years ago. And I've been listening to your conversation. I remember from the very beginning when Alex was still a meat eater. I remember that conversation. You were outdoor with a girl that I can't remember her name, and you were sitting outside and you were discussing eating
Rachel
meat.
Oates. Yeah,
Rachel. Yes, I remember that conversation. It was very interesting, because this is where I think I've been a philosophical vegetarian for quite some time, even when I was still eating meat. I never liked the whole thing. If I see a living thing being killed for my taste buds, I've never liked it. I've detached myself for long enough to live with it, but I struggled. Eventually, I ended up changing my lifestyle, and my wife and myself have done so. We're both atheists now. what is your stance right now on the subject? I know there are a few things back and forth, and I've seen Alex still talking to Matt Dillahunty about it as well. What is your stance on it?
So I made a video a while back on why we're not vegan, which was basically my position on the most prominent argument that's expressed for veganism, and I explained why I think most people don't accept it. And I'm in the process at the moment of making a video which I'm going to title The Best Argument for Veganism, because I think there's a really good one. It ain't going to compel everyone, but I just think it's a very good one. So I think about this topic quite regularly, but to answer your question as succinctly as I can, when I had that conversation with Alex, I was convinced of the moral landscape, and I believe in objective morality in that sense. And it just, if you take those core propositions, it just follows that veganism is true, that you've got to, do what you can to mitigate the harm that's caused in the universe. Whereas now I'm not someone that accepts objective morality pretty much at all. Like, I don't think it's not in that sense. I think there's an objective moral framework, but it's so different to what most people think that it's almost worth not saying it's an objective moral framework. I'll at some point express my views as they've been updated in a video. So for me, I think that what happens is people have values and they have intuitions, and whenever they do anything, they have a competition. There's a competition between those values to see which of them is going to win out. So if you live in a situation where you can easily get access to vegan or vegetarian food, then all of a sudden your value for, community, your value for getting sustenance, it can be easily met. So there's no friction between those two values of caring about sentient beings and also caring about other things coming to mind. There's no massive friction. Whereas in another situation, it might actually be, listen, you're not going to be able to eat for 48 hours if you're not willing to eat fish. Because say there's a situation where you're out and about eating fish. Because there's a competition between your values, some people that in every other context, or in the context of living, say, where I'm at right now, will eat vegan, they might go, yeah, I'll eat the fish, because like the value of me getting hungry is going to end up being more important to me than the value of caring about the sentience of the creature. People look at this, especially vegans, they think it's hypocritical, but I don't think it is. I think that what's happening is there's this competition of values that we have, and different circumstances are going to reveal for each individual just how much emphasis they put on each of those values. So one thing that's come to my mind is you could ask a vegan, when we eat vegan food, we have to unfortunately cause a few crop deaths. That doesn't mean whenever I mention this, some vegans think that I'm bringing up the crop death argument. I'm not. I'm just mentioning crop deaths for a different purpose. What you could say is that if your major concern is do not cause unnecessary harm, you should only eat enough crops to survive, and that's it. You shouldn't have any excess fat on you whatsoever. You shouldn't eat any of the products that require a few more crop deaths to happen, but it tastes better. So like certain grains will actually entail more death than other grains. And yet vegans don't live like that. Rather, they just have this line in their head of like, as long as it's vegan, I'm happy. Some of them do go further and say, actually, I'm not going to eat almonds. I'm not going to eat avocados or whatever it might be. And to me, I think everyone just draws a line that they're happy with, and no one actually takes it to its full conclusion, which would actually be stop eating. It would actually be death, in my opinion. It would really be, look, if your goal is stop all of the harm, because that's your goal, you would end up having to be in a state where you go, right, I can justify my life and my happiness at the expense of 10 crop deaths. What about the fact that I'm going to live for like 60 years? Is my life worth more than, say, 100,000 crop deaths? Or you can go on and on and on. And I know people don't process information this way, but it seems to me that if you take the premises, the thesis, then you are going to have to think of it this way. And everyone's just going to have to find an area where they go, right, I've got this confliction of all my values. That's where I'm drawing the line on this day. And it might change depending on the circumstance you find themselves in. It's a wishy-washy answer, but I actually think that humans are wishy-washy when it comes to their morals. So that's my view on it. And that's coming from someone that's about 95% vegan. The vast majority of my food's vegan. It's just, I can't for the life of me figure out an objective framework that I can buy into that makes sense of it, of anything like that.
Yeah, I'm very, very, very close to your stance. Are you motivated by the reduction of suffering of sentient
Yeah.
being?
Yes, I
Okay,
am.
so
Yeah.
that's the same. So would you eat a roadkill?
In principle, I've got not much problem with it. So as long as I didn't hit it. So
Yes.
let's just say that I found rogue. I was out. Let's say I go camping and I find that there's a dead rabbit, and I can tell that it's not got myxomatosis and it's not got something wrong with it. In principle, I've got no problem eating it. I don't care about eating meat. It doesn't bother me whatsoever. It's just causing unnecessary harm. That's the problem. It's causing unnecessary harm. But will I cause unnecessary harm? Of course I will. I have an iPhone. I don't need an iPhone. Why have I got an iPhone? Because I want it. My value for it. So at the end of the day, it supersedes the work conditions of those in China that built it. Why is it that I eat eggs? Like, because it's a very I've just noticed that it's a very useful and easy way for me to get the vitamins that I like. I actually like the taste of it. When I process the fact that I have to eat X amount of eggs for one chicken to be killed, and if I'm careful about where I get my eggs from, which I am, then it translates to basically you do this computation. Or I do this computation in my mind, and I'm like, I can live with that.
Yeah.
People think that's hypocritical, but my point isn't to say that it's not hypocritical. My point is to say, welcome to humanity. Like, I think everyone's hypocritical. I think that if you was to take a consistent view on this, you'd end up topping yourself. You'd have to. So I'm not appealing to that as a futility to say, therefore, eat meat or anything like that. I don't eat meat. I haven't eaten meat for about 9 years. I haven't eaten I haven't eaten red meat or poultry for about 9 years, 10 years. I haven't eaten fish for about 5 years at this point. So like, it's a complicated one, and in a future video I will be sure to try my best to express myself. But it's complicated. It's also, from what I can tell, not very popular. But I really do think that it's true. I think it makes so much sense of all of the moral issues that we've seen in the world to take the stance that I have.
I completely. Actually, I'm in agreement. I think our existence, our very existence, and our very regular usage of things around, utilities around us, will eventually put other species and other sentient beings to some sort of stress, whether you're aware of it or not. But that's the condition. If there is a design to this, I would have to blame the designer, because we're talking about a system that needs energy to survive, and that energy, unfortunately, has to be upon the predation of species on each other. There is imagine if you can get your energy from the solar energy. That would have been lovely.
Yeah, or just God, right? So in heaven, I'm assuming that you don't have to pay people to torture animals so that you can survive. Like, you can just survive on God's essence or whatnot. You can survive on nothing. Why wouldn't an all-powerful, loving God create a situation where you don't have this insane predatory situation, these intuitions, these dispositions that we have, where like genuinely a lot of people are not bothered at all when they cause harm to animals? It's like, this isn't a bug. It isn't. It's actually a feature of humans. We are. Again, saying that we are someone that does it doesn't mean that it's right. That's an appeal to nature. But the fact that that physiological apparatus is within us has to be, if you're believing in God, because of God. But of course, theists, at least in my experience, don't tend to lean towards veganism and whatnot. They think that humans are special and that we're built and that we've got dominion and control over these beings. And in fact, if you take the Quran or you take the Torah, it's not just that. They want you to hang these poor animals upside down, make them face Mecca and slice their throats. And it's just like, what good God would ever sign off on this nonsense? Like, it's just cruel. It's so just unnecessary.
Yeah.
Like, even if like you do need the meat, even if you live in a society where like your values for the meat's higher, do they have to be tortured that way? Like, really, is that the way that they have to have their life ended?
They're convinced that this is the best possible way to kill an animal, and that's the most merciful. They believe when they utter the words of Allah, it somehow stuns the animal, so they actually don't feel the pain. It's incredible what faith can do to you.
Yeah, and it's interesting, if you show like the videos of it to people, it seems that a lot of people just go, my goodness, that's horrendous, and they'll stop eating meat for a bit until they sufficiently forget about it, and then they go back to it, or they might give it up entirely. But there's plenty of people that's not bothered by it. And it could be they're not bothered by it because they've got the religious conditioning to think that, no, these animals are beneath us. Or it could be that, no, evolution has wired into us like that we only care for the in-group. And yes, the in-group's growing, but it's just taking it might only grow so far. We might not actually have that physiological apparatus to extend the circle as Peter Singer wants us to all sentient beings. It might be that a lot of us just don't have that. I'm not sure on that. That's an interesting question that I'd have to read more on. It's certainly not an area of expertise for me.
Okay, guys, we're wrapping up. So last couple of questions. Why 95% vegan and not 100%? Is there certain?
Yeah, great question. I'm just happy with it. I can live with it. It's good. So you could say, again, I'm not saying this is a point of hypocrisy or anything like that. It's just to give you an example. You could say, hey, why is it that this vegan's happy with eating vegan food, but they're also happy with eating avocado, and they're also happy with eating almonds, and they're also happy with eating way more calories than they need, which causes even more crop deaths? Why don't they go further and be really conscious of the foods that they buy and only eat enough to maintain their body fat? The answer they're going to give you is that they're comfortable. Like, they've made the decision, they've drawn their line, and they're comfortable. For me, it's like, will I lose sleep if I'm eating chicken? I will lose sleep. The reason being is that I would eat the chicken breast, and like for every breast you eat, you're killing a chicken. To me, it's just too much. But if you said to me, honestly, Steve, look, if you was to eat eggs for a year and used to eat them from the farmer down the road, well, can you sleep with the idea that you're killing a chicken, say, every year? Maybe it's bad of me to admit this, but like, yeah, I can. It just doesn't bother me. And likewise, if you said for all the 95% of the vegan food that you eat, can you sleep knowing all of the crop deaths that you cause? Yeah, I just can. It just doesn't bother me sufficiently. So, yeah, I don't claim to have the answers in this position, but on this topic, it is a difficult topic. But yeah, the ultimate answer to that is that I'm just comfortable with it. It's fine. I'm happy with it. It's enough for me to sleep, and yeah, I think that it works for me. That said, I'll probably end up 100% vegan at some point, but I don't think it's going to be for moral arguments. It's rather just going to be for other reasons.
Would you eat animals that, like, I eat some mussels and cockles?
Yeah, I eat mussels. Got no problem with mussels. It hasn't got a nervous system.
Okay, so we're very aligned. So you're looking for things. So there is no suffering. There is no pain.
Yep.
You don't see the problem. Same here. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
In principle, it's like eating meat is wrong. No, it's not. It's nothing to do with the eating of the meat. It's to do with the killing. And then, is it wrong? Well, I would have a conversation with someone that says wrong, because they're going to mean it in an objective, universal sense. But yes, just as I would with any proposition where they're saying that something is right or wrong.
Because it's going to lead to the question, those natural vegan people who would just disgusted by meat. They don't care about suffering. Yeah. They just don't like meat, and they end up in the same position as you, but they don't have moral foundation for their position.
Yeah, the thing is that a lot of, in my experience, most vegans are actually a bit more that way. So you can get like vegans that are philosophically minded, say Alex O'Connor or Peter Singer, people like that. But most vegans actually, in my experience at least, I'll ask them, why don't you eat meat? And the answer is something along the lines of, I don't eat anything with a face. And I'm just like, Jesus, that's not. Okay, fair enough. You're doing something that I think is good by my lights, but that's not a great answer. And then, yeah, but I'm sure I've got. Well, I don't know what else to say to it. It's just that's just the way it is.
It's an oversimplification of it, yeah. But the result is still the same thing for the cow. You don't get eaten, but it's not even the meat itself. Like again, we're going to a movie, Avatar, where the tribal people are, they're getting that animal, and they thank the animal for the meat. It's about to feed the entire village, and it's a scene where there's a respect, there's a mutual, almost trade-off in that sort of organism that's called animals, and we are animals too, so we're part of that animal kingdom. But it's when you do the batteries, when you remove the peaks of chicken so they don't pick at each other, when you grind male tiny chickens to get chicken stock and things like that, things that we don't really need, it becomes really horrible.
No, agreed. I'm agreed on that one. Not much to add, really. Can I quickly run off for a minute? I apologize for the delay.
Of course.
Quickly, it won't be long. I'll just leave you and your lovely audience.
No, that's all right. I might answer a couple of questions. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Constellation Pegasus, for your comment. Dr. Robert Price is going to come back soon in December. and we're going to start with the Joseph of Arimathea and John the Baptist, French characters from the Bible. So we're going to have them again. Thank you for your super chats. I'm just like trying to find any other questions that we might answer before Stephen leaves for the day. Yeah, but that's not the point. I'm talking about the point of doing it on purpose. We're talking about other sentient, aware beings. We understand. Yeah, nature is very cruel. I completely agree. It's horrible without the human intervention, but we don't need to add to that. We are aware we can do better. Do we need to do that in order to get something so tiny like chicken stock? Do I need to have cows enslaved to produce that dairy industry that for it at the very end for you to put a little bit on your tea, and that will justify the suffering of hundreds of millions of cows and their calves? So this is where the problem emerges. But I think Stephen and I have a different stance. I think in terms of from other vegans that we don't think we're going to be shoving it down people's throats. I think it's going to be a personal stance, and it's going to be a situation where we understand why some people need to eat meat. So it's not going to be militant, at least.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's right. So, do you agree? I mean, I can see now you don't want to take a militant vegan stance. You kind of have an understanding of other people that might need to eat meat or might have a different emphasis in their life, or their values might be different at that level. All what you're trying to do is you do awareness, you do discuss, but you will never shove veganism down people's throats, by the looks of things.
Well, yeah, there's two things to be said on that. The first is that I can't, because I just literally don't believe in an objective moral framework that's going to allow that to happen. I don't think that there's a leg to stand on where I can say you must live according to the way that I see the world in that way. I just don't have it. I can only appeal to their values and then see whether or not they're being consistent with their values. And the second, and the one that we were talking at the beginning about being convinced of certain things and changing your mind. I've went from someone that thought that I understood and I really did believe in objective morality, and I think there is a right way that things are meant to be. Whereas now I'm not convinced of that. I think that you can make so much more sense of the world if you assume moral anti-realism. And when I've done this deep introspection into my own intuitions and into my own views, I've realized that, and I'm more confident on it than I want to admit, and that is that even with my own values, veganism doesn't fall out of it. It doesn't. It's just in the right circumstance, in the right world, I'd be vegan, but in the wrong world, such as the world we're in now, I wouldn't. I'd be close to it, but that's it. And in a very wrong world, I just wouldn't be vegan at all. So, or anywhere near vegan. So I think you can only appeal to people's values and see where they go from there.
So, maybe the term objective is wrong to start with, because we're starting from a point where we're saying if something to be true, it has to be universal, or it has to be applied, or it has to be a priori, or it has to be intuitive. But what about consensus, where a zeitgeist of human advancement reaches a certain critical mass point, where you go, as human species, we agree in general that this is the right attitude to have regarding this particular issue. And that becomes the consensus, or what seems to be like a pseudo-objective morality. It's not really objective, but it's what we agree on.
So having a consensus doesn't really mean much to me, because at some point, in fact, for most of human history, we had a consensus that time is universally experienced exactly the same way, and it's not. We had a consensus that most things are solid, when actually we've realized now that no, the atom is predominantly nothing. We've had a consensus that most of us, that libertarian free will exists, and so vengeance and revenge should be an important part of the criminal justice system, whereas most of us don't. Well, outside of religious communities, most of us don't believe that anymore. You hit a consensus that the Earth is flat at some point, and it's like I don't really care for consensus all that much, and I think you can only appeal to each individual according to what they believe is true. And I don't believe in this framework, so I've got no business preaching this objective framework to others. I can only work with the values they've got. I have found that by being very non-pushy and just by appealing to people's values and just by just living a vegetarian / vegan life and offering people food so that they can, come around and I'll cook them some food, offering them some of my meals if I'm out with them. I think I've had 4 or 5 people convert towards vegetarianism. Some of them went towards veganism. I think there's a lot to be said of just live as you want other people to live, and like that really can have some impact, especially when there are a lot of voices out there that are quite aggressive with it. You almost need the counter to go, no, it's not that way. I mean, Alex has said this about veganism himself. Veganism has terrible PR. Terrible PR. They come across as like arrogant. Like a lot of them come across as extremely arrogant, extremely dismissal, extremely nasty in their rhetoric. They deliberately use language which makes it so that a conversation is going to immediately be explosive. And I get it, because like if you take the propositions that most of them believe, then what happens today is the worst thing that's ever happened. And I actually agree with that. I just think that if you're trying to make progress with people that don't agree with that, that language isn't going to be useful. It'd be like talking to someone that's, say, pro-life and insisting that they're actually anti-abortion, or the other way around. It's like the language itself, as we were discussing just before we went live, language itself plays a massive role in how the conversation's set and how it's going to move forward. Yeah, I really wish I had more definitive answers on this stuff, but I don't. I'm just.
It's work in progress. I think it's one of those things. It's work in progress. Yeah, I'm gonna check on myself every few months or about the way I believe, and I think this is how people should live their life. You shouldn't be comfortable with anything for a long period of time. You become stagnant. Very last question. We'll take that one, and we'll finish for the day. I think the Jews might have done it like the Muslims by cutting the throat, but that's if they're going to consume the animal. But if it's, I think the scapegoating comes from a Jewish tradition, where they get 2 goats and one gets actually pushed onto a cliff to take the sins of the village. So but to consume, I think they might have done it like the Muslim way. What do you know about this, Steve?
I'm not tremendously informed on the Jewish way, so I can only offer so much commentary. But one thing that comes to mind is, of course, Jesus' sacrifice. Like, that's scapegoating right there. The stories that's told is that for some reason you've inherited the sin of your ancestors, which, don't get me started on how immoral that strikes me. The idea that your ancestors can do something and you inherit the sin, like, don't start
vicarious redemption. That's horrible. Vicarious redemption is disgusting.
Yeah. And then God comes down as himself and sacrifices himself to himself, even though it's not a sacrifice, because nothing is lost. He lives forever. It's he's still omnipotent. There was nothing given in that sense. So yeah, Christianity very much is a scapegoat religion itself. I think Hitchens was stating this in God Is Not Great, and I remember reading it and thinking, yeah, that's true. It's a scapegoat religion. But as for the Israelites, I'm not sure. It's not a place that I have any level of decent knowledge, and I'm not all that interested, to be honest.
Yeah, I think we've got a couple of Jews have actually confirmed my understanding. Yes, that's the kosher method of butchering. So that's why I think Islam and Judaism are very close. They've got lots of traditions.
Yeah, I was asked by a Christian lately. They were like, "Surely you think that Christianity has a higher chance of being true than Islam?" I was like, "No." Like, one of the reasons is that Islam is way more like Judaism. Yeah. Again, Hitchens mentioned this with why heaven hates pork. No, sorry, why heaven hates ham in his chapter.
Yeah, ham is what you use, but you can actually explain it away. Muslims and Jews, the nomadic tribes, were very similar. Therefore, the religions were very similar. Christianity came from the bosom of sort of Hellenistic Judaism, and therefore it has elements of the Greek tragedy and a bit of sort of drama queen type of aspects to it, and it can be explained away. It's written in Koine Greek, for God's sake.
Yeah, the Christian was saying to me, give me another reason then. Like, okay, like you've got that one. What's another reason you've got for thinking that Islam might have a higher chance of being true than Christianity? I'm like, look, to be clear, I think it's basically 0 for Islam, but I still think it's higher than Christianity. Go on and give me a reason. I went to the Trinity. The Trinity. Just read anything in the philosophical literature trying to defend the Trinity, and it's just stupid.
I know. It gets very funny. I mean, you can see Christians actually argue amongst themselves about the nature of Trinity. And Stephen, I thought I was going to enjoy this conversation, but it was way more beyond my expectations.
You're welcome.
No, honestly, it just is because it was so nice and very, very, very flowing. Very, it's almost like a mate of mine that I've spoken to for years, and we kind of clicked, which is brilliant. Conversational style. But I know I've kept you for so long, and I know you've got a busy day ahead of you. Can you tell us right now, between now and the last 10 years? When you probably left Christianity about 10 years ago, is that sort of, or even more than that?
Never a Christian. But
you were never a Christian?
Nope. Never believed in any specific type of religion. But I think it's fair to say that I believed in God. Definitely not Christianity.
Okay, so you were like a deist?
Yeah, I grew up and I was like, okay, maybe there's a God, but it seems obvious to me that these Christians have got this wrong. Like, even at 8, maybe I'm just a weirdo, but even at 8, I was thinking about the inconsistencies of the omnipresence, omniscience, the problem of evil. Like, it came to mind quickly because I bounced around in unofficial foster care. My sister died just before she was born, so like a lot of like things like that, coupled with my genetic disposition, I think it is, just had me thinking about these things from the get-go. And even at 8, I was like, I don't think Christianity is true, but maybe there's a God. And then I learned about evolution by natural selection, and it was, I would describe as a religious experience in the sense that the cogs just fit, and all of a sudden the suffering, the injustice, and everything about the world, I was like, well, damn, that makes sense now. And so, yeah, I've not had a paradigm shift like that since. I've had a few, but like that one was just like, wow, okay, now the universe makes sense. Thanks, Chucky D. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for accepting my invitation. You really made my year 2022 by almost ending it in such a wonderful conversation. I hope you can be a guest later on in a few months again. Maybe this time we'll talk about one specific topic and we can zone in a bit more precisely. But is there any statement, anything you want to tell the audience here that you are working on, that you want to tell them about, or any other ideas?
Well, I'm always keeping busy and making more and more content on both Rationality Rules and Casually Debunked. I'm in the process of creating an expansion for Debunked as well, the card game, so that's going to be really, really fun. And I'm just keeping myself busy. I'm even starting to venture into different YouTube channels and stuff like that, which I'll end up sharing on my community tab at some point. But no, the last statement I want to say actually is I say reverence to you, really, and that is that I really appreciate the work that you do, the way that you are bringing this to the Arabic world, the way that you're taking this important information and with a smile showing Muslims and whatnot, what else is there to be said about atheism, about skepticism, about reason, rationality, consistency, and logic. You're a force for good, and just, I really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Well, thanks, folks. Tomorrow we have a program. We've got Dan Barker and Jonathan Pierce. We're going to be covering the problem of evil. And next week we've got Michael Sharma to talk about his book about consciousness and why do intelligent people believe in stupid things. But once again, thank you so much, Stephen. I'm so grateful, and we'll see you guys later.
Pleasure's all mine.